We begin with a problem. Across the ancient world, from the Korean peninsula to the Nile Valley, from the rainforests of Mesoamerica to the megalithic graves of prehistoric Europe, we find an object that appears again and again, the crown. It takes many forms: a band of hammered gold, a crest of deer antlers, a tall construction of jade and metal branches, a circlet of delicate beads or shells, a towering plume of sacred feathers. The materials change, but certain features recur with a kind of structural insistence. Symmetry, radiance, height, precise placement around the human head. And not just appearance, but effort. These are not casual ornaments. They are labor-intensive, resource-heavy constructions. Beaded Yoruba veils require tens of thousands of glass elements. Silla crowns from Korea incorporate thin sheets of gold shaped into branching tree-like structures that serve no defensive or utilitarian purpose. Mesoamerican feather headdresses demanded long-distance trade routes and the ritual sacrifice of rare birds. In Neolithic Europe, even before metallurgy, we see circlets composed of carefully drilled and shaped stone, bone, or shell. The earliest known gold crowns from the Varna necropolis, dating to over 6,000 years ago, contain nearly pure gold hammered into thin, gleaming forms worn around the head. In each case, the effort is real, the intention unmistakable. Now consider what happens to these objects. They are not always passed down. They are not always kept in use. In fact, some of the finest and most carefully constructed crowns are placed in graves, interred with the body, removed from circulation. This is especially striking in small-scale or early societies, where material wealth is sparse and labor-intensive objects are rare. Why would such a high-value item be buried? The conventional explanation is that these are symbols of status or rulership, buried with their elite owner as part of a display, either of wealth, power, or social standing. But this view leaves much unexplained. It does not account for the enormous variety of crown types that appear in societies without formal kingship. It cannot explain why so many are buried in isolated contexts where no one could see them. And it cannot reconcile the huge amount of skilled labor involved with an object that supposedly functioned only as a sign to others. So let us consider another possibility, one grounded not in power politics, but in human psychology. What if crowns were not made for others, but for the self? What if their primary function was not to signal dominance or office, but to alter the experience of the wearer? Here we begin to see a more satisfying alignment between material and motive. The commonalities across cultures, the weight of the crown, its placement around the cranium, the use of shining or reflective materials, the balancing of symmetrical shapes, the inclusion of pendants that sway or beads that obscure vision. These are not necessary features for a symbol, but they are highly effective tools for changing how a person feels. To wear a crown is to feel its weight, to become aware of posture, to slow one's gait, to have the head subtly encased, pressed, framed, to hear the sound of beads shifting with every movement, to feel a field of light reflecting around one's face. These sensations are not incidental. They produce measurable effects. Psychologically, such stimulation activates bodily awareness, creates a sense of elevation, sharpens the boundary of the self. In ritual, performance, or trance contexts, these features would enhance absorption, facilitate altered states, or reinforce identity transformation. So crowns are inherently psychosomatic devices. They produce psychological changes by engaging somatic channels through tactile pressure, movement constraints, optical shimmer, and spatial symmetry. They are deliberately constructed to do something to the person who wears them. This interpretation also clarifies burial practices. If a crown was not merely a public token, but a personal instrument, an object that shaped the way a person moved, thought, and felt, then it makes perfect sense to bury it with them. It was not just part of their status. It was part of their self. And here we begin to glimpse a deeper pattern. Across time and space, humans invented similar solutions to similar inner problems. They discovered that placing structured, gleaming, often symmetrical objects at the apex of the body could induce feelings of clarity, presence, heightened identity, or spiritual alignment. These were not symbols in the modern sense. They were technologies, tools for modulating attention, emotion, and embodied cognition. And this is why the crown recurs. Not simply because it signifies rulership, nor solely because it transforms the inner experience of the wearer, but because it belongs to a triadic dynamic that continually reinforces itself. The act of adorning the head with luminous, symmetrical material satisfies three human drives at once: the impulse to refine and elevate the self, the impulse to project that refinement outward as authority or beauty, and the technical impulse to shape matter into forms that reflect both. Each of these impulses feeds the others. A more sophisticated crown refines the sensory and psychological effects on its wearer, but heightened presence strengthens social influence. The recognition of that influence motivates still more elaborate construction. Over generations, this cycle of enhancement, display, and innovation becomes a cultural constant. Rulership, craft, and consciousness evolving together around a single locus, the crown. Thus, the persistence of crowns across time and geography is not an accident of symbolism, but the consequence of this closed circuit of reinforcement. The crown endures because it succeeds simultaneously in three domains. It feels transformative to wear, it appears authoritative to witness, and it demands ever greater ingenuity to make. In that synergy lies its longevity. Whether in gold, feathers, or beads, the crown is the point where psychology, society, and technology converge into one enduring artifact. Which brings us to a question. If crowns reliably produce effects on perception, attention, and selfhood, what is the mechanism? What kind of interface exists between brain, body, and world that would make these effects possible? To answer that, we must look not just at what crowns look like, but where they are placed, and how that placement might connect to the brain's own structure. Perhaps then, what crowns alter is not just behavior or appearance, but the energetic interface between consciousness and the body itself. And perhaps the first clue lies within the brain's own internal map of the self, the cortical homunculus. If we are to understand how a physical object encircling the head could alter perception, we must first understand how the brain itself represents the body. For while the skull appears to separate the inner world from the outer, the relationship between brain and body is not divided by bone. It is continuous, mapped, and alive. Within the folds of the cerebral cortex, each part of the body has its corresponding echo, a patch of neurons dedicated to sensation and another to motion. When neurosurgeons in the 20th century stimulated these cortical regions directly, patients reported specific sensations: touch to a finger, a twitch of the lip, a tightening of the jaw. From these observations came one of the most evocative diagrams in neuroscience, the homunculus, the little man of the brain. This figure is no metaphorical decoration. It is a precise topography of embodiment, drawn in neural space. Along the strip of tissue running from the temple over the crown of the head, the sensory and motor cortices, the body is laid out like a distorted map. Hands, lips, and tongue loom disproportionately large, trunk and legs shrink to near insignificance. The distortion corresponds not to size but to sensitivity and dexterity. The more finely tuned the body part, the more cortical territory it commands. To visualize the homunculus is to see how deeply the sense of self is inscribed in matter. The head does not merely contain the brain, it contains an image of the whole body, projected across its surface, responsive to every movement and touch. When we speak, gesture, or fix our gaze, Electrical patterns ripple across this living map, moment by moment redefining where we are. The importance of this becomes clear when we consider where crowns sit. The diadem rests directly above the sensory motor band, the very ridge that encodes bodily presence. Pressure here is not neutral. Light touch on the scalp registers within the cortical homunculus itself. Repetitive stimulation, weight, temperature, rhythmic movement, can alter the intensity of that map. In laboratory settings, such focused input changes proprioception, balance, and even emotional tone. What we call posture, poise, or bearing is not separate from neural geography. It is its outward expression. Modern imaging extends this understanding even further. The brain's electrical activity doesn't actually stop at the skull. It generates electromagnetic fields that are measurable just beyond it. These fields, interestingly, correspond closely to sensory and motor rhythms, the living vibration of the homunculus projected outward into space, not in some mystical sense, but as a measurable electromagnetic coherence that matches rhythmic neural potentials. We might think of them as a faint but continuous halo of information, a sort of channel through which the brain and environment communicate. If this is the case, then the head isn't just the seat of consciousness, but the apex of a field system, a convergence point where internal representation meets the external world. The homunculus gives that system its structure. It's like the architecture of how the self is mapped, felt, and expressed. This perspective reframes the question of the crown in strictly physiological terms. A device placed around the cranium, pressing lightly upon specific zones, reflecting light and sound, introducing symmetry and balance, would interact directly with the brain's map of the body and the fields that extend from it. It wouldn't need any mystical properties to influence the wearer's state. It would only need to exploit the principles of cortical representation and feedback. Thus, when ancient makers designed objects to encircle the head, they may, consciously or not, have been engaging the same system that modern neuroscience now reveals, the interface between bodily form, neural mapping, and the ambient field of perception. But perhaps there is a more grounded explanation still, one that connects these psychological and neural insights to the physical materials themselves. For gold, crystal, and patterned geometry are not arbitrary. They have properties that interact with light, heat, and electromagnetic forces in ways measurable by physics. To understand why such materials were chosen and why crowns take the forms they do, we must explore how structure and substance could shape the very fields that the homunculus projects. That inquiry brings us to the third part of our discussion: the physics of brilliance, symmetry, and resonance, the possible link between ancient design and the modulation of neuroelectric fields. Having seen that the crown engages the cortical map of embodiment, we now ask how its materials and geometry could further influence that map through physical resonance. We reframed the crown from a symbol of rulership to a tool of selfhood, and then from a tool of selfhood to a structure positioned directly within the brain's own map of embodiment. Now we bring those perspectives together into a single physical model. The crown is not simply worn upon the head. It participates in the same electromagnetic system through which the brain maintains awareness of the body and the world. It is, in effect, an externalized component of the neural field, a cognitive resonator. The human brain is an electrical organ. Billions of neurons fire in rhythmic coordination, generating oscillatory fields that span a wide spectrum of frequencies. When these rhythms align, when waves across distant regions of the cortex synchronize, the result is coherence, focus, and a distinct quality of experience. These fields do not end at the skull. They radiate outward, forming a weak but measurable electromagnetic envelope around the cranium. The shape, symmetry, and conductivity of materials near the head can therefore influence the distribution of these fields. In modern laboratories, this is evident in the use of transcranial stimulation devices, which alter cortical rhythms by applying subtle electromagnetic patterns from outside the skull. Ancient crowns, though made without electronic components, operate on the same principle. When highly conductive materials such as gold or copper are arranged in symmetrical geometry around the head, they become part of the brain's field environment. Their presence modifies how charge accumulates on the skin, how light reflects around the eyes, and how temperature and weight are perceived along the scalp. Every change in these physical parameters feeds back into the nervous system through the sensory and motor pathways mapped by the cortical homunculus. The crown thus closes a loop. Neural oscillation generates a field. The field interacts with the crown's geometry, and the resulting pattern alters neural oscillation again. If we imagine this interaction as a resonant circuit, its behavior can be described by three linked variables: material conductivity, geometric symmetry, and proximity to cranial nerve plexuses. Gold, the most common medium for sacred crowns, excels on all counts. It is highly conductive, malleable, into perfect symmetry, and stable against corrosion, maintaining consistent electrical properties over time. Crystals, meanwhile, add optical and piezoelectric effects. They refract light into rhythmic flicker and can convert mechanical vibration into minute electrical potentials. The combination of metal and stone therefore creates an integrated interface, reflective, conductive, and resonant, aligned precisely with the brain's natural field structure. Within this framework, the traditional features of crowns begin to make sense not as decorative excess, but as engineering logic. The radial spikes of a solar diadem distribute field lines evenly around the skull, promoting symmetry of sensation and posture. The vertical height of Egyptian and Mesoamerican headdresses shifts the wearer's proprioceptive center upward, inducing a felt sense of elevation and stillness. Weighted veils and pendants introduce slow, periodic motion at the edges of vision and hearing, gently entraining neural rhythms in the low-frequency bands associated with trance and focused attention. Each element, material, geometry, balance, light, contributes to a single goal: the stabilization and enhancement of conscious state. From this perspective, we can articulate a simple principle. Any structure of conductive or reflective material placed at the cranial apex or perimeter, when organized in symmetrical or harmonic geometry, will entrain local neural oscillations in proportion to its coupling with the cortical field, thereby altering subjective experience. This is the essence of what we might call field crown resonator theory. It explains why high conductivity materials such as gold and silver were favored even in regions where they were rare, why spiral and radiating motifs recur across cultures, why the most elaborate crowns are also the least practical for movement, and why so many of them accompany the dead. Each of these patterns reflects not social convention, but functional optimization, refinements discovered through long experimentation with what changes the way a person feels when adorned in a certain way. The implication is profound. If the crown shapes the brain's field, and that field defines the boundaries of self-awareness, then the crown is a device for adjusting consciousness itself. It can elevate still or expand perception by modulating the interface between neural activity and environment. Over generations, societies may have learned that certain forms consistently produce desired states, clarity, solemnity, illumination, and encoded those forms in ritual and myth. The symbolism of the crown as a source of light or authority would then follow from its effect, not precede it. The power represented is the power experienced. What emerges from this line of reasoning is not an ornament, but an interface, a meeting point where the physiology of the brain, the geometry of form, and the symbolism of culture converge into a single technology of consciousness. The crown, in its many manifestations, reveals that early societies were not only expressing hierarchy or divinity, but were experimenting, generation after generation, with the very architecture of the self. They discovered, empirically if not analytically, that thought has a physical field, and that matter placed within that field can shape its coherence. Seen in this light, the ancient craftsman is not just a decorator, but an engineer of experience. The meticulous hammering of gold into thin sheets, the patient threading of beads into balanced veils, the alignment of feathers into radial plumes. All of these actions become operations on cognition itself. The maker is tuning the head's resonance, and the wearer, upon donning it, steps into a sort of modified perceptual environment. The sensation of weight, the shimmer of light, the rhythmic movement of pendants, all of these feed back into the brain's own map of the body, altering tempo, focus, and self-awareness. The crown does not signify transformation, it performs it. People did not continue to make these objects for thousands of years, only because they represented authority, but because they enhanced it. They made them to help guarantee that leadership itself operated from reliable states of mind. States felt as clarity, elevation, or even communion. The crown thus becomes the material expression of a triadic relationship: cognition, object, and command reinforcing one another. The authority of the leader depends on the lucidity of perception. The crown stabilizes that lucidity. The experience of lucidity, in turn, legitimizes authority. Each element feeds the next, forming a closed circuit of meaning and physiology that sustained the idea of sacred rule. The ruler's steadiness of mind was not assumed, it was cultivated through ritual, posture, and resonance. In this sense, authority was not only political, but neurological. If we trace this understanding across cultures, the pattern holds. Wherever humans placed rare, symmetrical, radiant materials around the cranium, they were building on the same unspoken recognition that consciousness is not confined, that it can be stabilized and magnified through structure. The crown therefore stands at the boundary between psychology and physics, ritual and neurology, a deliberately fashioned bridge between inner and outer fields. Its persistence through time is testimony to its efficacy. Leadership demanded coherence, the crown provided it. Reinterpreted through this framework, the burial of a crown no longer appears as the entombment of a symbol, but as the preservation of a circuit. The artifact remains near the skull because it belongs to the same system. It is part of the extended self. Death, in this context, does not sever the link between body and field, but relocates it into stasis, with the crown acting as a resonant companion, holding the pattern that once animated the living brain. In sum, the evidence across archaeology, psychology, and biophysics converges on a single insight. The crown is a human attempt to formalize consciousness in matter. It is both instrument and icon, both map and mirror. It records an ancient intuition that mind, light, and geometry are aspects of one continuum, and embodies it in metal, crystal, and form. What these objects reveal, when freed from the vocabulary of power, is a far older ambition: to stabilize awareness, to extend perception, and to shape the invisible architecture of being. The crown endures because it works, not metaphorically, but experientially, as a technology through which human thought, leadership, and world perception enter into resonance with one another.